Today we're talking about range and distribution patterns of species. So, a species range is the area where a species can be found. And range tends to be a dynamic thing, which means that it can change over time. It's not static. So, according to different factors, that can cause ranges to expand or it can cause ranges to contract. That could be changing environments, it could be interactions with other species, it could be abundance of food. Diagram we have here is a telling diagram. It is the change of the grizzly bear's range in North America over time. So the historic range, which you can quite easily read as the pre-European settler range, went all the way down to Mexico and pretty much made it to the Mississippi in the US and easily into Saskatchewan in Canada. However, since settlers have come, the expansion westward has pushed the grizzly bear pretty much just into Canada, largely out of Alberta and the lowland parts of BC, and almost completely gone in the United States and completely extant in Mexico. The only real place that you've got grizzly bears still in the US is the northern part of or southern part, depending on which country you're in, of the Rockies, as well as Yellowstone National Park. The factors that control range also cause a number of different dispersion patterns throughout that range. And those factors could be things like distribution of resources, food, water, shelter, types of interactions between different populations, like we saw with the grizzly bear, types of interactions within populations as well. How much competition is there for food and for mates, for breeding spaces, as well as the distribution of offspring and reproductive strategy. And these factors are also variable. They can change with the seasons. We can quite easily tell lots of herbivores have a much tougher time in the winter because there's not as much plant life to feed on, or they can even change by time of day. Bats will spread out at night, but they will clump together during the daytime when they're roosting. Because they all need a safe space. So they're willing to tolerate each other a little bit more when they are resting and not out hunting. So we have three basic dispersion patterns. First one we're going to talk about is the uniform dispersion pattern. This is pretty easy to describe. It's when everyone is evenly spaced out, hence it's called a uniform. And you can see that with the penguins on the right here, right away, because all of those penguins are nesting. And they are all spaced out exactly the same distance because they're all approximately the same size and they do not want anyone getting close to their eggs. So they will attack any other penguin that tries to shove in on their space. And this is also about preserving the safe space as well for their eggs to develop on. Very common to see uniform population distributions amongst nesting birds that gather like this in large numbers to reproduce and to have their offspring. And typically this is indicative of territorial competition over a resource. We actually see it in plant species a lot too. They will evenly space out, and one of the cool things about plants is plants actually use chemical warfare against one another. We don't see it at all because plants' pace of life is so much slower than ours, but they fight vicious wars using acids and chemicals to try and keep each other away. So they can tend towards a uniform distribution too. But you'll see this with territorial animals as well. Sometimes it's territorial in that they don't want to allow anyone to mate with their partners. Typically, that is a male behavior. But it could also be territorial and just trying to preserve food. You'll see that with lots of large carnivores. You'll see that with birds that'll fight over spaces to try and attract a mate, or just to try and keep enough food for them to be able to survive. Clumped distribution is kind of the opposite. This is where organisms cluster together. And often this clustering is to make better use of resources, or when resources are distributed into patches. So wolves, of course, are the classic example because pack behavior is an example of clumped distribution. So is herding behavior, and in that case, herding behavior can be more about just safety in numbers. So clumped behavior or clumped dispersion is another very common one we'll see. The rarest dispersion pattern is random dispersion, and that might seem a little bit weird because, like, what's easier than random dispersion? Well, when you have to fight for resources, anything is easier because random dispersion only works if resources are both plentiful and evenly distributed. So dandelions, if you look at a field, often just grow wherever they land because they are, as many of us know, very stubborn, very hardy plants. They can just grow wherever, even if it's in a crack between the pavement. They're very tough and very good at surviving. So even in areas where other organisms wouldn't randomly distribute, dandelions can. But that tends to be the exception rather than the rule, because random dispersion means that there's either a lack of interaction between organisms, which is rare, or there's a lack of competition. So you tend to see random dispersion in areas that also have very high abundance resources and not a lot of predators. Because as soon as you've got predators, you've got selection, and selection has a tendency to disrupt random dispersion.